Matthew Ho, how are you? Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you for having me join you. I appreciate being here.
Thank you. I've been looking forward to it. The timing is just right as well, because this was just after the Trump inauguration.
Right.
So yeah, plenty to talk about.
Yeah, and it's actually a lot of oddities about this inauguration. I mean, the prime one being is that nobody in the U.S. has seen what happened on Monday, where you had the second inauguration being an inauguration that was buffered by another administration. So no one in the U.S. has ever seen a president come into office for his second term separated by someone else's term. And so that's just the first thing that makes this whole thing odd. But, and that's a curiosity, right? That's trivia. But the thing that I think is startling to many people is how quickly this administration is acting, how quickly the Trump administration is carrying out his promises. And it's startling. It's scary. It's impressive. You could say that as well. There's a debate term called gish galloping, and it's when you debate somebody and you say your opponent says so many things, right? Throws so many things at you, has so many questions, has so many facts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that you can't respond. And that's what I think a lot of us in the U.S. are feeling, because the amount of work that the Trump administration has done, the amount of executive orders, say, they've issued in the last 2 days, has been overwhelming. It's impossible to keep up with it. And people are I think that was purposeful, to just overwhelm everyone and get so many things done right away that people don't notice some of them. So it is troubling. It's startling, and in many ways, it's impressive because they did come in prepared to do things, which is, I think probably the thing that the biggest difference between this entrance into office and the entrance into office in 2017 is how well prepared the Trump administration is to carry out what their goals, their priorities, their promises are.
I think you're right. I was also pretty impressed. It kind of shows it's like a statement of intent on his part. And but yeah, it is scary as well, because you're absolutely right. There's barely any chance to figure out what the hell's going on, and in that kind of chaos, a lot of things can be slipped in without due kind of debate or checks.
Right. So, I mean, just as we were before I came on, I was reading about Trump administration has reintroduced what's called the Muslim ban, which of course was extended to include countries like North Korea, but essentially it barred people from entering the United States from about 7 different countries up until they added North Korea, all Muslim countries, and that's been reinstated. But the significant thing about that, besides its reinstatement, of course, is how things have been added to that. So not only is it going to bar entrance to people from Iraq, Syria, Yemen, other places, but it's also giving the authority to remove people from the United States who are from those countries. Yes. So you see, it's not even. They're taking things beyond what they did in their first term. So certainly, phrase you hear all the time, what lessons were learned. I think the Trump administration clearly did a very good job of looking at what lessons can we learn from our first time around and do better. And they're very competent. They're very capable. And that makes them extremely dangerous. We can laugh at them. We can mock them. We can ridicule them for many of their statements, how they act, their false Christianity, things like that. But we have to understand and appreciate that they are competent and they are capable and they are demonstrating an ability to get things done and doing so in a very rapid manner. And it's not just having an effect on Americans. You saw Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping have a call right after Trump's inauguration, and my understanding of that call had a lot to do with what Trump is putting into motion right now. And we just saw Trump saying late last night or this morning in regards to China that he's going to immediately impose a 10% import tariff. And that's on top of the 60% tariffs he keeps talking about. So other nations, not just here in the U.S., but other nations are, I think, startled as well at how quickly this administration is acting.
I didn't know so the tariffs have started, have they?
He's threatening to start them immediately. Wow. So the comments on the 10% tariff, which is separate, which is a new thing I had not heard until this morning, separate from the 60% tariff on Chinese goods that he's been talking about, for years now. But this is an import tax, as he called it, that would begin immediately, as he said to the reporters yesterday, begin next week. But we've seen this as well, where he's talked about implementing tariffs on February 1st, including towards Canada and Mexico. So there's a seriousness here that we really have to take on. And I think for people who haven't watched his inaugural address, it's only a half hour. It's worth the time because there are typical Trumpisms in there. And he says things that, God saved me from the assassination attempt in Pennsylvania to make America great again. You can scoff at that. You can mock that. We can debate whether he's serious, whether he believes that or not, or he's just saying that to, his base will like it. There's those parts and components of the inauguration. But the centerpiece, the meat of that speech, detailed his priorities and his plans for his administration. And so that's why I urge people to listen to it, because it is a very serious speech and it gives us an idea of what he's looking to do, not during his term, but immediately.
In Trump's previous term, there was, obviously, it was very divisive. And there was an analysis, I'm not sure who I heard this from, but it was really apt, I think. And it was saying that, so the people who support Trump, they don't take him literally, but they take him very seriously. And the people who oppose Trump, they take him literally, but not seriously. Right. And I think now we need to take him literally and seriously.
Right. I had not heard that phrasing before, but it's very, very apt. I think that's very correct. Yes.
Hey there. I hope you're enjoying this episode. Let me just take a moment to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode is kindly being sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited, or WLC for short. WLC is a complete A to Z Amazon account management service. So if you're looking to start an e-commerce business, or you already have a business that you want to take to the next level, then get in touch and WLC will be able to help. Just for transparency purposes, let me also mention that WLC is a company that I personally created and am a director of. So when you get in touch with WLC, you will be speaking with directly myself or my team, and we very much look forward to speaking with you to see how we can serve your needs. Thank you. And with that said, let's get back to the episode. And also, we'll go into more detail about the Middle East and about the war in Ukraine later in this discussion. But just the fact that he was able to enforce that ceasefire is, for me, that was quite a big thing because, first of all, it was even before he got to office. And previously he had said that he can stop the Ukraine war with one phone call, and people kind of laughing about that. But just seeing that, that was pretty impressive. But it also shows that he's not ideologically committed to a lot of things that the previous administrations were. It doesn't mean that in some ways he is like more has greater kind of good in mind for the whole world. Right. Trump wants what's good for Trump, or maybe what's good for America, if you listen to him. But he's not committed to the ideological kind of motives that previous governments were. So also this peace deal that has been not peace deal, but the ceasefire that has been negotiated is exactly the same that was there from like 13 months ago. So
Hmm.
in some ways, because it didn't get imposed before, we have to think that the previous government has blood on their hand. They could have done this.
Right. It certainly they could have, and you're right. Sheikh Al Tahani, the Qatari prime minister, said exactly that. This is the deal we had in December of 23,
Yes.
and then in May, end of May of 20, December 23, and then end of May of 24, the Biden administration essentially put that plan forward again, changed a few things maybe, but it's essentially the same plan as you were saying. And then July 2nd, Hamas agreed to it,
Yes.
let alone what could have occurred prior to that, because the Americans don't really do anything about negotiations until the spring of 24. And that had a lot of domestic political pressure was the cause for that, during Biden's campaign, that domestic political pressure, particularly through what was called the uncommitted movement within the Democratic Party, that were turning out in fairly large numbers for how American politics works. Enough that what you had was you had the Biden administration not saying the word ceasefire at all until
Yes.
March of 2023, and then no real active attempts to do anything about it until a couple months afterwards, essentially. So yes, the blood on the hands is there, for their role in allowing this to go on when the Americans have complete and total leverage over the Israelis in this situation. And the Israelis have said this over and over again. Now, the issue then becomes, well, the Israelis have leverage over the Americans in the American political system because the American political system is, put it bluntly, a legalized bribery system. So just as industries in the U.S. control our pharmaceutical and healthcare policies, our banking and finance policies, of course, you have the military-industrial complex. You have an Israeli lobby in the United States that exerts enormous control, not just influence, but control over the U.S.'s Middle Eastern policy. So that had a lot to do with it as well. But certainly the role of the United States, in the role of the Biden administration in the genocide, essentially the only thing the United States didn't do to take part in the genocide
Yes.
was to drop bombs themselves. Everything else, I mean, so Israel's genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza is essentially America's genocide as well. And as we see, and we'll see what occurs. I mean, I'm not certain what the Israelis are going to do next. They certainly have launched large-scale operations in the West Bank. That, of course, is in preparation for the annexation, which is the Israeli main goal. So Israel's priorities have always been the annexation of the West Bank. The West Bank has always been the jewel for them. Everything else, including the horrible slaughter, the massacre, the genocide in Gaza, have all been essentially a supporting effort to prepare Israel to annex the West Bank, and that includes their operations in Lebanon, Syria, conflict with Iran, etc. So what the Israelis do, I'm not certain, because they can't do both. They can't resume the genocide in Gaza at the level they were carrying it out and carry out the annexation of the West Bank. So we'll see. And that had to have been a part of the discussions between Steve Witkoff, who was Trump's envoy, who was giving the credit for getting this deal through. So that had to be the part of the discussion between Witkoff and the Israelis over what comes next. And you've certainly seen enough sources, both American and Israelis, who say, yes, the Americans gave us a green light to resume our operations in Gaza whenever we like, as well as we know from a lot of reporting that the Trump administration will be supportive of the Israeli annexation of the West Bank. So again, what the Israelis choose to do, I'm not certain, but this is the point where we're at. Certainly the use of, if people watch the inaugural address from Donald Trump in the Capitol building, in the Rotunda, as it's called, there is little mention of Israel and Palestine. He kind of goes right over it, 2 or 3 sentences maybe. He spends more time talking about Panama than he does Israel or Palestine. And, for those of us who were watching at the time, we were shocked by that because we assumed he would be taking credit for this hostage deal, as it's called here in the United States, right? He would be the one who'd stand there and say, I'm
Yes.
the one who got the hostages back to their family in Israel, right? And he really didn't do that in his inaugural address. But later in the day, when they had a big event inside an arena in Washington, D.C. called the Capital One Arena, that was the centerpiece of that event. They brought American families who have hostages being held in Gaza onto the stage with Trump. They have big yellow scarves around, the yellow scarves representing, of course, bring them home. They were holding photos of hostages. Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy, spoke about 15 minutes, and then Trump, after he shook hands and after all the hostages' families thanked him for what he had done, gave a speech with the hostages' families as the backdrop. Of course, no reference whatsoever about the Palestinians, about what they have endured, the suffering of all of that, as well as, too, of course, no mention of the realities of the conflict, the occupation, the apartheid, the decades and decades of ethnic cleansing. So, you see, though, I think from that an idea of where this administration will go, that it is hand in hand with the Netanyahu government. I think the Netanyahu government have very good reasons for carrying out the ceasefire right now. Operationally allows them to reset their forces, refit their forces. If they are going to carry out annexation of the West Bank, they can move forces as well. Too, the ceasefire with Hezbollah is ending next week. So, they may have to do something with regards to that. Strategically, again, if they feel they're done with Gaza, they've done enough, they got their pound of flesh, and they can move on to their main effort, West Bank. The ceasefire is a transition. And then, of course, politically, it works well for Netanyahu both ways. He's now able to say, because of me, because of my efforts, I got Hamas to release the hostages. He's able to take that political crisis in Israel and get victory out of it. And also, too, of course, that political crisis is now dying down in Israel, because that's what the issue has been, not about the genocide, but about the hostages. And then he has the ability to resume their operations in Gaza, to begin the genocide again. And so politically, Netanyahu has gotten himself in a position where he's been able to get the best of both sides for himself. And so this last year and a half or so, 15, 16 months, where he's been walking a political tightrope, once again, Benjamin Netanyahu, probably the foremost political survivor, the guy always keeps coming back, has done it again, it appears. To the point that the government is still in power. And the whole thing for the last year was that if he attempted a ceasefire, he would lose power. And he got through that. And so, where we go again, I don't, it's hard to tell. But certainly we can mock and we can ridicule Netanyahu and Trump, but we also have to realize what we're dealing with here is two very savvy and competent and experienced leaders.
Yeah. Also, how secure do you think is Netanyahu's government now, given that in this ceasefire, if you look at all of the objectives that Israel had for going into Gaza, whether it was eliminating Hamas, having control over Gaza, having control over the Philadelphia corridor, potentially driving the population over to Egypt, potentially taking over the northern part of Gaza. None of that. They failed on every single point that they had for going into the conflict. And if we all look at, on the other hand, if we look at all the motives of Hamas, it seems like that they achieved everything. They didn't allow Israel to have control over their land. They didn't allow control over the northern part of Gaza. And at least even now, until like a week or two ago, they're still attacking inside Israel from northern Gaza. And that kind of shows a lot. And in terms of their strengths, it seems like in the numbers that they have, their numbers have grown, not reduced, since the war started. And that's kind of natural when you have invading forces from outside attacking, causing destruction and mayhem. The people that are there are going to try and join the resistance, which is what's happened. So how, in terms of like his staying power in the government, how strong do you think he is, given Ben Gvir and others who are threatening to leave the government?
I think he's probably pretty secure. I think he brought. I mean, Ben Gvir has his party, the Jewish Power Party, only has 6 seats. That alone is not enough to bring down Netanyahu's coalition. He's got 68 seats out of 120, and he actually also brought in a new member to the coalition. I can't remember the name or how many seats they have, but the big thing is Smotrich's was it Religious Zionist Party or whatever it's called, and that has he has 13 seats. So Smotrich does have that control, but it seems as if Smotrich is hearing from Netanyahu what he wants to hear. And it seems that the cabinet is aligned on this, whereas you had, I think the cabinet vote was 14 or 15 to 8 or something like that for the ceasefire. But this cabinet also has on their resolution about the ceasefire that we will resume our military operations. We will reoccupy all of Gaza, and we will take control of humanitarian aid. And not, and in the way I read that was not that there are, if this happens or if that happens, it was, we will do this. So again, we're unsure what the Israelis are going to do here, because they can't do both Gaza and the West Bank at the same time. So it's not clear. But I think Netanyahu believes he's in a politically, I don't call it safe space, but stable space. I think polling has been back and forth on this over the last 15 months or so. But you've seen where Benjamin Netanyahu is still the most popular politician in Israel. Now, that's, he's most popular because he has plurality, 33 or 34%. But it shows that his base is unwavering, and they believe him, they trust him, and they will follow him. And you could see the way his government is doing damage control right now, where you had those terrific videos, against the backdrop of the genocide, against the backdrop of all that horror. You had on Sunday when the Israeli hostages were turned over by Hamas to the Red Cross or the Red Crescent. You had, throngs of people, many thousands of people turn out to support Hamas and demonstrate their support for Hamas. And you saw Hamas defiant in their uniforms. You see all the video coming out. You see Hamas, again, very clearly in all the video coming out. So not just providing imagery of, you didn't defeat us. You may have destroyed us. You may have killed many of us, but you didn't defeat us. And as you said, that they have actually grown in numbers, more likely. And I actually just saw a report the other day that their weaponry, in some regards, has been diminished, but in other regards has been heightened, because the Israelis dropped so many bombs, fired so many missiles and artillery shells. And you're always going to have what's called a dud rate, so a certain amount aren't going to go off. And the amount of unexploded ordnance that Hamas now possesses is essentially a lifetime's worth, right? So even in that sense, you didn't degrade Hamas militarily by wearing down their stocks. There might be some issues where they don't have as many rocket motors to fire the rockets anymore, but they can manufacture those, So, but the thing about it is, not only weren't defeated, you have Hamas and many Palestinians saying this ceasefire deal is a victory for all the reasons that, you stated, right? I mean, and it's shocking. It's terrible to see the genocide, what occurred there, the suffering. But from the perspective of those who are resisting, from the perspective of those of the Palestinian people, what you hear is that we could have either died like this or died slowly, right? Died fighting or died on our knees. And, the horror of it. And you certainly do see some Palestinian voices, not many. I think the media has to really search to find them. But you do see some Palestinian voices out of Gaza saying, what was this all for? My family's all dead. Everything's destroyed. And you certainly, I think many of us identify with that sentiment. Many of us from the outside looking in say, my God, what does it all matter? Look at all the death and destruction. But we are not living as an occupied people. And that's been the history of of mankind. The desire for freedom, the desire for liberation, to endure suffering and violence, because the humiliation of occupation, the humiliation, the subjugation, the humiliation, enslavement is so much greater than what death and destruction can bring. And I think that's what we're seeing here. And this is something that was said, on October 8th. Many people were saying this. Many Israelis were saying this. There's no victory here. And, that's essentially what you have. I mean, now you have, as you said very well, that Hamas actually achieved many of its objectives, and Israel failed to achieve most of its objectives. They could cite and they say, we killed Ismail Haniyeh, we killed Yahya Sinwar. But the way these things, new guys come in. That's the way it works. We had a saying in the U.S. government, in the military, about what's the most dangerous position in Al Qaeda to be. And the answer was the number 3 guy, because every month we were killing a number 3 guy, and guess what? They just made another number 3 guy. But I think we also have to understand too that many of the Israelis' purposes in this were, of course, the ethnic cleansing piece and resettlement and fulfillment of all that, getting rid of the Gaza problem so they could focus on the West Bank, those sorts of things. But also, too, much of this was just death and destruction for death and destruction's sake. Yeah. Much of this was just the violence put upon the Palestinian people for the sake of violence, out of decades and decades of hatred and hostility and fear. And so they were successful in that, in the sense that they did destroy Gaza. They did kill an untold number of people, ruin so many. And I think that was one of their goals, because that was a goal just in itself, to do violence for violence sake.
Exactly. It seems like the only real objective that they had was to kill as many women and children as they can, to turn the population against Hamas. But even there they failed, which is what they did similarly try to do in Lebanon as well, and it's kind of failed there as well. It's unlikely. It's not going that strategy is not going to work anywhere where you bomb the hell out of a land and hope that people will turn against their own leadership. If anything, at that stage, they're going to reunite. It also reminds me, talking about killing of the leadership, it also reminds me, because my background, my family is from Pakistan, and we, on the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan, we've had troubles for years, and the military's been trying to fight these kind of what we call TTP, or Tehrik Taliban Pakistan. And basically, that's what happens every time you knock off one of their leaders. Instantly, another leader will come along. But now that new leader is going to be even more resilient than the first one, because they have more to prove and make a space for themselves. So it's going to be even more difficult to negotiate with them, and they're going to fight even harder.
Right. Yeah, I mean, my time in Afghanistan, when I was there when the Pakistani Taliban, marched out of the Swat Valley.
Yes,
right. The story I tell about that is the fact that to Americans, what I'll say about the growth and support for the Pakistani Taliban, I say, like, look, imagining your town, you've got some people who talk about you talk about the dangers from the outside. You talk about others are going to come in here and do these things to us. Maybe they throw some religious aspects into it, but always the danger of the other. And then you ignore them. You think they're crazy or they're conspiracy theorists. And then the drones start appearing overhead, right? And in Pakistan's case, the Pakistani army comes into what was called Northwest Frontier Province at the time, comes in, and then the checkpoints start getting put up. And then you hear about next town over, a family was killed by a drone. And then your mother and sister come home and tell you how they were humiliated at a checkpoint, so on and so on and so forth. And now all of a sudden, those guys, in your town who were talking about this kind of stuff, they're making a lot more sense now, right? And they were right all along, right? I mean, it's just like that type of efforts by these governments are often the things that cause the support for these militant movements. And we have all kinds of data on that. I mean, that was the case in Iraq, it was the case in Afghanistan. In around 2016, 2017, the UN did a study of militant, jihadist, whatever you want to call them, movements across of Africa. and found that 3/4 of the members of those groups had joined those groups because they had relatives or friends killed by government or foreign forces. Right. When I resigned from my position in Afghanistan in 2009 over the escalation of the Afghan war, we had an intelligence report that got leaked out to the media in the U.S. And it was very clear. We understood the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, that 9 out of 10 of them were not fighting us because of religious motivation or ideological zeal, but 9 out of 10 of them were fighting the Americans and the occupying force and the Afghan government because they were being occupied, because of the presence of foreign soldiers, or because of what you essentially could say the continuation of the Afghan war that went back to the 70s that had what was essentially a Cold War legacy. I mean, so it was because of outside powers, or many times corrupt governments that are backed by outside powers, that push people into these organizations.
Yes.
And we saw that, in Iraq as well, the same story. I mean, you could talk about this, almost anywhere. But in these circumstances, it's the most extreme who are available to take on those who are looking for help, for assistance, as well as a way to fight back. I mean, so it's the same tale gets told over and over again, and it's ignored over and over again. And I think a lot of it's because of entitlement. A lot of it's because of arrogance. But it's always been that way. And I imagine it will continue to be that way, that the same dynamics will happen, particularly when you're dealing with an imperial power like the United States that continually utilizes divide and conquer strategies. So, to continue, I mean, that's as old as the Romans and the Greeks, longer, I assume, right? I mean, so, but as long as you're going to have that divide and conquer, well, those who are on the wrong side of the imperial power, who are they going to turn to, right? And so, you're essentially putting them into a position where they're going to accept help from wherever they can, and oftentimes that help ends up being groups that otherwise they would not align themselves with.
Matthew, you have a lot of experience in Afghanistan. I'd love to have an episode with you to do with Afghanistan as well, because there's actually a lot going on in Afghanistan at the moment. I did my master's as a mature student in 2010, and my dissertation was on the resilience of the Taliban from 2001 to 2010.
I'd love to talk to you about that. And I'd love to read that if you could send it to me. I'd love to read
definitely.
That.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because at the moment there's so much going on in that area, which is kind of because there's so much other things happening in Ukraine and Middle East, is kind of going unnoticed.
Right.
But firstly, for the first time now, the Taliban government in Afghanistan and Pakistan have been there's been border clashes between them both. And at the same time, there's some talk of Pakistan taking over the Wakhan corridor that kind of links to China, so that they have direct access then to Turkmenistan and all of those areas. And all of that is kind of TTP is kind of involved in all of this. And also we have obviously influence of ISIS there as well.
Right.
And I do think there is a lot of that legacy of divide and conquer, which also reminds me. So if we look at recent history, I can't remember any time when, whether it was America or before that, European powers, the British Empire, the French, any of these have brought two conflicting nations together. Similarly to what China has done, for example, with bringing Iran and Saudi Arabia together.
Right.
And they were trying to bring Turkey and Syria together, and that kind of didn't pan out just quite right. But you don't have any of those examples because it was a clear kind of a policy, starting maybe from the British times, that divide and conquer, and there's a legacy now in all of these areas with the colonial powers existed previously, that tribes, nations, they're still struggling to kind of come to terms with each other.
Yeah, I mean, I could give you a bunch of examples of the United States foreign policy pushing countries together as a consequence of America's action, right? So not as a plan, not as a result of good intentions, or because but because of these countries trying to find a way to get away from the dangers of the American empire. And the Trump administration is only going to exacerbate that. Certainly this threat of sanctioning everyone, that's just going to cause nations to try and protect themselves. And by protecting themselves, they're going to align with others,
Yes.
But certainly I think that the most striking example of this is the relationship between Iran and Russia. Just last week, they signed this supposedly massive strategic partnership that's going to last for 20 years. No one really knows what's in it, but supposedly it's very robust and covers all types of covers trade and energy and transportation, as well as security and defense and intelligence and things like that. So, I mean, you have this reality that Moscow and Tehran are now allies, and that's pretty ahistorical. If you had gone back, decades ago and said this was going to be the case, people be like, you don't know your history. There's no way Russia and Iran are going to be friends. I mean, but because of our policies, that's the way it is. You can say the same with Russia and China, right? The relationship between Russia and China is very strong and very growing. And, one of the arguments of some of those in the Trump administration is that we should have better relations with Russia to peel Russia away from China. That's, very Machiavellian, Zygmunt Brzezinski, Henry Kissinger type machination that I don't think the United States has the competency to do. But if we were to act in a more cooperative and reasonable manner with other nations, that is something that could occur. But certainly what you're seeing is more countries heading into institutions like the BRICS, because one, it provides a better path forward for them. They are more assured in the certainty of the rules, the regulations of the BRICS institution than they are of our international institutions, because essentially the United States has destroyed that credibility. There is no certainty in the post-World War II process anymore. The United States has done away with that. I was reading, a thing the other day just about this, where why nations are more inclined to align with China than the U.S., because you say what you will about the Chinese government and human rights violations and all that, but at least in our relations with China, we are certain where they stand and what will occur, and they're not threatening us the way the Americans do. Last year or 2 years ago, I read a comment from I can't remember which country, but from an African official, one of the countries there, I can't remember. But, essentially he said, look, when we deal with the Chinese, we end up getting ports and railroads, right? When we deal with the Americans, we end up getting commandos and drones and lectures. And so the United States has put itself in this position where it is ushering its own demise. And there was a clip that was a viral clip of Donald Trump from his first night in office 2 days ago, where he's asked a question about BRICS, and somehow he believes that Spain is in BRICS. And he goes on, and then he questions the reporter along the lines of, "You don't know about this, do you? But yeah, you should go read about what BRICS is about." And here's a guy is saying that Spain is a member of BRICS. This ignoramus who's sitting in the Oval Office right now, who's threatening to throw tariffs at everybody. And if anyone joins BRICS, we're going to give them 100% tariff. That's what he says. That's only going to further push nations to a lot, right? I mean, but this is the reality of empire. I'm sure if we went and dissected the various empires as they decline, they make moves, they carry out policies, they do things that further exasperate their decline. There's a saying, I'm not sure if folks say it outside the U.S., but that a dying mule kicks hardest. And that's what's so very dangerous, is that you have this American empire that's in decline, that is thrashing about, that took its role after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where it became the single empire, where it became the world's hegemon. And rather than acting reasonably and in a manner that would not just benefit itself, benefit others, thereby guaranteeing its place as, the top of the world order, it chose to abuse that position, and of course, most especially act as a raving homicidal giant, stomping throughout any nation that it felt opposed them. And that now is on the economic order as well, as we've seen, particularly since the Obama administration, this economic warfare throughout the world, where now, what's the number? Over a quarter of the world's people, maybe more, are under U.S. sanctions, sanctions that don't work, but make things difficult for countries. And again, that just pushes nations to band together to find institutions that are reasonable and reliable and provide some degree of certainty as well as protection. And so even, so it is, you see that just both on individual levels, but on national levels, how the very actions of the U.S. empire push people and nations to be opposed to it.
Exactly. And this is why I've been struggling to understand America's thinking strategy. Successive governments in America have identified as China as the main competitor, the main threat for USA, whether it was Obama with his pivot to Asia, or then Trump came along threatening China. Biden's been the same. And yet, somehow, instead of concentrating on that main challenge that they have, somehow they've started wars against Russia in Ukraine and pushed Russia closer to China. They've started all of this stuff in the Middle East, threatened Iran, pushed them closer to China. Even Saudi Arabia, they're pushing closer to China. At the same time, while they're doing all of this, they're weakening their own resources. They've kind of run out of weapons to even supply to Ukraine and Israel. Right. So how are they actually, what is the thinking? I'm thinking, maybe is it because there's so many lobby groups in the USA and every one of them sees a different enemy, a paranoia against Russia, Iran, everyone has their own, and whichever one kind of, on a given day, whichever one comes good, the government just seems to go that way. But I think what you said about like a dying mule, I think that kind of explains it maybe a little bit better, because I think I'm trying too hard to come up with a strategy for USA. They don't have one. I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have, it's not, there aren't these rooms where they sit. I mean, they do sit around, they do have meetings, but it's always about the immediate. It's always about, right? It's not, there's not these rooms with the big maps on the walls and they're all in these leather chairs and they're thinking, okay, what do we do about, right? Twiddling their fingers, and what are we going to do about, Asia? Okay, here's the 5-year plan, and we're going to, various departments have those types of things, but they're not important in the sense that the policy is made by those who are in the White House and also at the cabinet levels. And so, you had this, I can't remember who wrote it, but a number of years ago said, if these 25 people didn't exist, the Iraq war wouldn't have happened. Right. So taking the stance of the Iraq war, that wasn't something that came from the inertia, the institutions of the empire. That was a decision made by the Bush administration and specifically a handful of people. Right? Maybe not even 24. Maybe it was less than 25. Right? I mean, so I think if you step back and you say, okay, this is an empire, and they have an imperial mindset, and of course, with that, you have you can kind of look at it cleanly in the sense of course, the empire is always going to have to at least maintain itself, if not expand. And this is seen clearly when George Kennan, who very famous American diplomat, he's the one who authored this containment strategy against the Soviet Union. He also was very public against the expansion of NATO in the 1990s as well. But, in the late 40s, Kennan writes a memorandum to President Truman. And he says, look, Mr. President, the United States possesses more than 55% of the world's wealth, and we have less than 5% of the world's population. It will be the duty and obligation of every successive administration to continue that inequality, to continue that imbalance, right? So you have that imperial need. Also, too, the idea that an empire it's a living organism in its own right. So there is that inertia there. And I go back to what John Steinbeck wrote in The Grapes of Wrath about the banks, about how they are a living organism and they have to continue to grow, how corporations and banks have to continue to grow or they will die. And there's reality to that, right? If you look at how shareholders, stock owners are the most important things for the decision making of corporations. Corporations have to show they grow, otherwise their shareholders get very upset, and that causes, right? I mean, so you could see that phenomena actually on display in how things actually work. So, I mean, with that clear, kind of clean idea of imperial mindset, you can have a better appreciation, I think, for why and how the United States chooses to do things at times. But however, that's not the end of it. You have the corruption that you were talking about. You have the corruption of the weapons industries, of the banks, the fossil fuel companies, lobbies like the Israel lobby that are able to purchase policies and budget from our federal government. So the influence is massive. So you already have an imperial mindset, but that is exaggerated, exacerbated, and reinforced by these institutions that benefit from more aggressive and more hawkish and more warlike imperial policies, right? So you have a corruption that rots the already rotten imperial mindset. And then the third thing, to make it even more complicated, and this is why it's never a simple explanation, unfortunately, right? It always takes me time to do this, and I appreciate you giving me the time to talk like this. The third explanation is that the United States is a democracy. It's not a very good one. We've got our problems. We got Donald Trump as president. How good a democracy can we be, right? But we are a democracy, and it is a two-party system, and that the idea of domestic politics still comes into play. Right. And so you see things like Karl Rove, George W. Bush's advisor in 2001, 2002, saying to Bush and to all the Republicans, war is good politics. Wartime commanders in chief get reelected. Right. You see that when Obama comes in office, David Axelrod and Rahm Emanuel, Axelrod, Obama's chief strategist, and Rahm Emanuel, his chief of staff, saying to him, Mr. President, drone strikes will make you look strong. And then when the debate about surging the war in Afghanistan, escalating the war in Afghanistan, which Obama didn't believe in at all, he's confronted with Mr. President, if you start drawing troops out of Afghanistan and a bomb goes off in Times Square, you're not going to win re-election in 2012, right? But there's also the counter to that when wars go bad, foreign wars have a domestic political cost, right? So you see that in 2006, you see that's why Barack Obama gets elected. Because of the Iraq War. That's why he defeats Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primaries. That's why he defeats war hero John McCain in 2008. That's why George W. Bush signs the status of a forces agreement with the Iraqis in 2008 that says we are getting out of the Iraq War, right? Because that's Bush's attempt to try and get the Iraq War out of the 2008 election. Other reasons as well. I mean, that war had been lost. We had to get out of it, et cetera, et cetera. But that is a prime factor. So you have the reality of empire, how empires have always been, that imperial mindset. You have the corruption of the American system. And then you have the domestic politics that go back and forth as to being, yes, we want to go to war 2 or 3 years later. That was the worst thing we ever did. I mean, you look at public polling. Look, I just saw something the other day. In early 2003, in the run-up to the American invasion of Iraq, you had, and British invasion. I don't want to leave you guys out either. You had public opinion polls between 70 and 80% of Americans were supportive of the invasion of Iraq. There's a poll done in the last year or so that more than 50% of Americans say they opposed the Iraq War in 2003, right? So, yeah, I mean, it's statistically impossible. But you have that, and you can see that wars are very popular to begin with. But when the moral weight of the war, when the lies are exposed, when the cost of it, then the public very often turns against that. You can see that in Korea, you can see that in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, the same trajectory in the public opinion. And politicians are sensitive to that. The empire is sensitive to that. And that's why you've seen a change in American imperial, American war making since the second half of the Obama administration to be indirect, to be proxy wars, or to be silent wars, right? Using CIA and special operations and drones, because or using contractors, mercenaries. because the political costs to war are too much for the empire. So, unfortunately, it's not an easy thing to say it's just this, because it's not. And there's other aspects of this as well. When you get involved with Israel, that kind of turns the traditional model of an empire upside down. And why does the United States even have this interest in Israel? Well, it's because the American empire takes over from the British Empire. The British Empire was very clear about its interest in Palestine and then Israel. The Governor General of Jerusalem in forget what year it was, and sometime in the 1930s, he says that our purpose here is to build a loyal Jewish Ulster in the midst of a potentially hostile sea of Arabs. So Palestine and Israel for the British was always about having that colonial presence in a very important region of the world, very important for multiple reasons, but particularly say in the 20s and 30s with as industrialization was rapidly occurring, had been occurring before, but particularly the need for oil was so much greater beginning in the 20s. Having that loyal Jewish Ulster in the Middle East made a lot of imperial sense. For the Americans now, it really doesn't. The strategic benefits of Israel are just not there. But again, you can't. So if you just took it from the imperial mindset, you would think that the American empire would say, we don't need Israel. It's strategically a drag on us. It causes us problems. We don't even have bases there. All our bases are in in Turkey. They're all throughout within the Gulf monarchies. They're in Jordan. They're in Egypt. We don't need Israel. But then you have these other two factors that come into play: the corruption, the rot of the government, and then domestic politics. And this is why you have this American relationship with Israel.
I think that makes a lot of sense. If I look at the two main things that like corruption and democracy, because corruption is a problem in a bigger problem in countries like Russia, China, Iran, all developing countries, but somehow they manage it better in terms of it doesn't impact the foreign policy of the governments as much as it does in the West for some reason. And I think that's because there's a combination of corruption and democracy where everyone is more interested in their personal survival rather than what's best for the country 10, 15, 20 years ahead, when they're worried about elections in 2 years or 3 years' time and how they're going to survive that. And even here, like when I talk to people in the UK about previous wars, they all kind of say that was a dreadful idea and we should never do anything like that again, and we should be more independent. We should stop listening to the USA and stop allowing USA to drive our foreign policy, all of those things. But then as soon as a new war kicks in, everyone's kind of up for it again, exactly as you said. But then so that's kind of the situation of the West, that first of all, Europe as a whole has kind of just outsourced its thinking, its foreign policy, everything to the USA. The USA doesn't seem to have like a long-term strategy at all. And their adversaries are countries like Russia, Iran, China, other countries that are thinking not in 5-year terms, but in kind of 100-year terms, 50 years time scale. So I think it's that, and combined with the fact that despite all of the West's shortcomings, there's still a very real force and power, and they have a lot of capacity to cause chaos and destruction in the world. And so it's a very kind of a scary mix of what's going on.
It is. I think that juxtaposition of corruption in the U.S. compared to, say, corruption in Russia and China is something really worth examining. And why do these nations that do have real corruption, why are they able to carry out better policies than the West can? And I'll focus on the U.S. because I'm American and that's what I know best. But certainly you could say that. I'm sure if we had a friend of ours from Germany come on, they could, right? I mean, like Germany's decision, right, to what the German government has done, particularly say backing the Ukraine war and the havoc it has wreaked on Germany.
It's unbelievable,
right? How is that decision made? And I have an appreciation for those states that fall under the American empire particularly those who are, they see themselves first among equals, and their need to continue to be in favor with the empire, as well as seeing the benefits of being that. And these nations, of course, were once imperial powers themselves. I'm not sure where you live, Tafim, in London, but you probably don't have to walk too far to find a statue of some former conquering admiral or general or somebody, right? And the same goes for Berlin or Copenhagen or, wherever, so there is all that, but it is you see these nations that are corrupt. I don't doubt the stories about Vladimir Putin's vast wealth and mansions and all that. I'm sure some of it's exaggerated, but I have no pretensions that he's not thuggish in many ways, but he's very competent, he's very capable, and there is corruption throughout the Russian government. And you see purges at times. You've seen senior Russian generals and officials within, say, their Ministry of Defense, within their military, being arrested for corruption, very serious corruption that keeps stuff away from the front lines, right? I mean, so harms their actually war fighting efforts, harms their soldiers, but still they're able to carry out policies that make sense viewed from the Russian perspective, right? So how is that? And I think you could say the same about China too. I mean, the Chinese themselves say we have a serious issue with corruption, yet they're still able to carry out policies that lifted 500 million people out of poverty. Like how are they able to do both? And I think it's because, as you said, it's a different form of corruption, and the political system is different. And our corruption is not about self-enrichment, but about staying in power.
Yeah.
And, there's a lot of really great analysis on American corruption and politics. A lot of blame gets put on television, just to, go down this path for a short moment, in the sense that up until the time of television, radio really starts it, but up until the time of television, corruption in American politics was much more of the, I will pay you to deliver this, right? So in a sense of like, I want the road built, here's the envelope and the cash to get the road built. After television, when campaigns became so expensive because of the requirement to advertise on TV, and this begins with radio, but really with television, it becomes much more of a corruption where the politician is owned, right? Where the politician is bought ahead of time to ensure how they act, as opposed to being, hey, this bill's coming up, we've got to pay this guy off, right? And so it's about staying in power for American politicians, whereas maybe in other countries, it's about self-enrichment, as you were saying. I think a lot of times people are shocked when they look at American political corruption scandals and see how much money is actually involved, because it's oftentimes not a lot of money. You could buy American politicians and own them for not a lot of money. So I think, but that's a really, interesting, I think, examination to conduct. Why is our corruption so much worse than other countries' corruption in terms of being able to affect what's in our national interest?
Exactly. So backtracking back to the Middle East, to West Asia, and this ceasefire that's taking effect in between Israel and Gaza, Hamas. First of all, I don't expect Israel to abide by that ceasefire. They've never done so, going all the way back to 90s before that. Not only do they not abide by any ceasefire, but they try their best to kill off the negotiators that are negotiating, including Ismail Haniyeh, a recent example. So I don't expect them, unfortunately, I hope the ceasefire lasts a long time, but thinking about it, I really doubt it. But again, I don't understand what options Israel has, because they've tried for almost 2 years now, a year and a half, and they militarily haven't had success anywhere, whether it's Gaza or Lebanon or Iran or Yemen. There's been a bit of success in Syria, but in long terms, we'll see who comes out benefiting from what's going on in Syria. But so if they haven't had that success until now, I just don't understand which path they're going to pursue. And from a Trump point of view, I think Trump will back them as far as they see them succeeding. But I don't think Trump has a lot of patience for failure, as he keeps saying he doesn't like losers.
Right.
So I don't see what actual options that they have. But secondly, eventually, when this whole thing, the conflict, the military kind of conflict ends at some stage, whether that's it now or 6 months or a year or 5 years, whenever that is, Israel is going to have to face a new reality that it didn't have before. So how is it going to cope with that? Because previously, Israel in the Middle East was somewhat untouchable. And also it had this kind of policy of escalation where it dominance of escalation where it can kind of escalate things far beyond anyone else in the neighborhood. But that's kind of reversed now. So first of all, Hamas has shown how the Iron Dome is penetratable, and that at any stage, if they're still around, if similar things happen, potentially they can attack again. Whether they'll do it or not, obviously that's a different thing, but they can. Iran, for the first time, has been attacking inside Israel and has demonstrated that Israel doesn't have the defense mechanism for that. Yemen, Hezbollah. So all these forces. So when it all settles down, Israel is going to be more vulnerable than it was before, and it's not going to be able to change that just by attacking here and there and everywhere.
Right.
So how are they going to cope with that scenario?
Gosh, one, I think we have to understand the Israeli government, the political circles, particularly, but also the media, social circles, their education system, as being similar to the Afghan Taliban, in the sense that the Afghan Taliban are willing to do whatever it takes to see their vision fulfilled. And if that means their people suffer and die, they're shut off from the world, so be it. And that's the way the Israelis see it as well. This is a historical, biblical aspect of how they view their Judaism, that they have always been a nation that has been under siege. It's always been a nation that has been opposed by all. That's always just been Fortress Israel. And so I think for many of them, the idea of that essentially occurring, as you were saying, essentially Fortress Israel, is in line with their beliefs, is in line with their expectations, is in line with what history tells them, both modern history and biblical as well as cosmic history. So it's reassuring to them that they're on this path. And we have to be very careful that we don't, again, with the Afghan Taliban as a good example, that we fail to understand that there are true believers out there. That there are people out there, there are people in power who are supported by constituencies who are motivated by their convictions. And this is something I think in the West, we are very cynical, maybe skeptical is a better way to describe things. I mean, you see Donald Trump in church. Does anyone really believe that he and his family have any interest in the gospel? Absolutely none, except for maybe the parts they can cite that somehow provide a divine mandate for his presidency. So understanding it that way, that, and then there are others too, maybe not those in Israel, the more centrist, if you want to call them, the Benny Gantz's, the Yair Lapid's, the security focused ones, the nationalists, security focused ones, who view this as being necessary about building up these buffer zones around Israel, who have to feel that they have to always be on guard, are always manning the walls because they are civilization versus barbarism. Netanyahu is not in that camp, obviously. He's more in the religious reactionary camp, settler class camp. He said this over and over again when he spoke to the U.S. Congress over the summer. This is a war of civilization versus barbarism. And that is a belief that's held. And that's a belief held in American circles as well. Trump's generals that he had in power with him, General Mattis as Secretary of Defense, General John Kelly, his chief of staff, and General H.R. McMaster, who's his national security advisor, those were men who viewed the way in the same way. Again, an imperial mindset. They see themselves, those generals, as modern day legionaries who have to be out in the borderlands defending civilization from barbarism, as well as being prepared to extend the empire, not just defend the empire, but extend the empire. So those types of mindsets, I think, are important to keep in mind. We're not dealing with rational, reasonable, realist type thinkers, right? We're thinking about people who are motivated and who believe their convictions. Some of them, it may be cynical, but for many of them, it's not. And that's a mistake that we make at our peril if we don't appreciate that these convictions are true. It goes back to kind of what we were saying before about resistance. You saw that with the Americans in Iraq and Afghanistan, where, these people aren't fighting us because they're opposed to national liberation. They're opposed to they're in favor of national liberation. They're opposed to occupation. They're fighting us because they're being paid to fight us, or because they're part of a criminal gang, or because they're dead enders hanging on from the former regime. So if we just give them jobs or we build them wells, they will support the occupation, right? This fundamental misunderstanding of what motivates human beings, right? The natural order, the things that define us, motivate us, and of course are historical as well as natural. So those things, I think, are left out of our policy making very often, and certainly our media commentary on these things. The Israelis also too believe that they have the backing, and not believe, they know they have the backing of the United States. And so we haven't talked about the economics and all this, but you could have an Israel that has been downgraded 5 times by the credit rating agencies, right? That has seen, these numbers are old. This number is 6 months old. It's probably even more now. 40,000 businesses shut down, right? Where in October 2024, both their imports and exports were down by 1/3, on and on and on. We can run through all these different numbers to show just how Israel's economy is bleeding out. But the reality is they're backed by the United States. And in particular, they're backed by the American loan guarantees. So back in the 90s, the United States starts providing loan guarantees essentially to support the Israelis resettle Russian Jews into Israel. And this is mainly supposed to be for helping them build out housing and infrastructure and things like that. Of course, a lot of that then occurred in the West Bank, right, as settlements. But, these loan guarantees still exist. Yeah. And there's not a heck of a lot of money in that pot. Congress reappropriates it every year, $3 to $4 billion. Not a heck of a lot of money. Mm-hmm. But the reality is that the bond market, the securities market, understand that the Israeli debt that's being issued is backed by the Americans. It's guaranteed by the Americans. And that if a push comes to shove, the Americans will do whatever they need to do to fully support Israel. And this is why the Israelis over the last year have sold 400% more bonds than they normally do, right? And this is how they keep their economy afloat. And so they know that as long as they have this lifeline from the United States, and as long as they're moving forward in accordance with the Zionist vision, as well as what both their modern and biblical history tells them, they are moving forward in the right direction. And so they're willing to be Fortress Israel. And there are many, many Americans who love the idea of Fortress Israel, who love the idea of Israel besieged among all sides, surrounded by their enemies. That's been a talking point in American politics for decades. The only democracy in the Middle East, surrounded by their enemies. How can we not support them? Right. So, looking at this in a realist lens or a reasonable lens or a historical lens, you say this is madness. But looking at it from their perspective, it makes a heck of a lot of sense. Now, again, what they'll do next, we'll see. I also think the Israelis are very, very buoyed by the results of the last 6 months, where they see it, they took Hezbollah off the battlefield. Now, Hezbollah may be returning to the battlefield in a week's time. We'll see what happens to ceasefire. But the Israelis are very proud of that accomplishment, as well as they're very proud of what occurred in Syria. Netanyahu took a lot of credit for that. How much they were really involved, who knows? They're now on a collision course with Turkey. So, what they got in Syria now, they are on a collision course with Turkey. So it may, that may turn out very badly for them. But certainly, I believe they've checked Iran. Deterrence has been established on both sides. And we'll see what the Israelis do with Iran. Certainly, for the Americans, Iran is the white whale. And the Israelis certainly have that desire for the blood of the Iranians, desire to take the Iranian scalp, if you will. just violence for violence sake, just like they did with Gaza. They'd like to do that with Iran, but they'd like the Americans to do that. And if the Americans do that, that gets back to the West Bank in the sense that the Americans attacking Iran take any pressure from Iran off of Israel, right? But the Israelis are also understanding this Iranian ballistic missile fleet can penetrate our air defenses. So they're checked to a degree, right? Gaza, what will they do in Gaza? We don't know. Certainly, as you said so well earlier, their goals in Gaza, except just genocide for genocide's sake, they failed to meet. And of course, the West Bank being the priority, their main effort. How do they choose to carry out that annexation? When do they choose to carry it out? I mean, certainly if you're looking at the news in the last couple of days, it looks as if they're beginning those operations to do so. What will annexation look like? I think you'll see ethnic cleansing in the rural areas, in the towns and villages, what's called Area C, Area B to a degree. The cities will be isolated. They'll be left to kind of wither and die on the vine. And then places that the Israelis hate, like Jenin refugee camp, they will carry out vengeance upon. And I think that's what annexation will look like in a big macro kind of level. But they need a lot of troops for it, and they need a lot of forces for it. The Israelis are stretched thin militarily. And, one of the things that's interesting, I'll end this because I know I'm kind of on probably way too long, more of an answer than you probably wanted. But the Israelis have just recently decided to create 5 new brigades of troops, reservists, 38 to 58-year-olds, right? Oh. So the idea being that you bring in these older men and women to man the checkpoints and to stand a post someplace or to drive a truck or do whatever, because you need the younger men and women to be on the streets of the West Bank, kicking in doors, shooting children, doing what the IDF does. And so they recognize that need for manpower. And you've seen that in statements from Netanyahu, from his cabinet officials, from the army, about the need to shift to the West Bank. It's been called the silent war these last 15 months. Nearly 900 Palestinians killed by the Israeli army in the West Bank. Few dozen killed by settlers. And one thing that's, I think most people don't realize, the Palestinian Authority, the PA, has killed as many Palestinians, maybe a little less, maybe a little more, than the settlers have. So you see that dynamic happening of, another aspect of occupation, the collaboration, right? And the role of the PA in all of this. And so, where this is all going, the coming year for Palestine is going to be a difficult and treacherous and ugly one, I think.
Going back where we started, in terms of the inauguration of President Trump, and the things that he's been talking about immediately before that time, things like statements about Canada, about Panama Canal, about Greenland. What are your thoughts about those? Should they be taken seriously? Or I saw one of your previous episodes, and I heard you talk about like the shortage of sand, and that's something I've never heard of before. Right. So I kind of looked into that a little bit. Do you want to just tell us what that is about?
Yeah, and I was correct, right? I wasn't mistaken about that.
No, you're right.
Yeah, sometimes I say something and later I'm like, holy cow, that was from several years ago. Am I still correct about this? Right. So, but yeah, there is a worldwide sand shortage. There's a great documentary on Al Jazeera from like 7 years ago or so about the sand mafia, particularly focusing on India and South Asia. You need sand to build things. And there is a worldwide sand shortage, essentially. One of the things about Greenland is as the glaciers melt, a lot of sand is there. So there's that resource there, but also too, Greenland has the rare earth minerals that are so important to technology, everything, our phones, electric vehicles, so forth, very dependent upon these rare earth minerals. And Greenland has them. Greenland's place also as well is on the Arctic Circle, which in the Arctic Circle, everyone expects to play a much bigger role strategically for nations because of the resources that will be able to be tapped once the ice really starts melting, as well as transit routes and everything. So, I mean, everything I just said, right, comes back to climate. Something we haven't really touched on, but we see how that's affecting these decisions, whether or not these people in power want to believe climate change is actually occurring.
Yeah.
But, so what that gets to, though, with Greenland and why these comments about Greenland and Panama need to be taken seriously is because an argument is made, not just national security, about that we got to do this because the Russians will go in there, or the Chinese will go in there, or whatever. Those are the arguments being made. But more serious below that, I think what Trump gets briefed upon are the economic security. And he brings that up quite a bit. The economic security requires us to do this. We need to take Greenland because we don't have these rare earth minerals here. China has 90% of them, or whatever the numbers are, right? We don't have this ability. If we don't have a source of these metals and alloys and minerals and everything else, we will be entirely dependent upon the Chinese, right? And so that economic security argument makes sense. I think it's rather specious, but it makes sense to many people. Same, of course, for Panama, right? I mean, Trump is upset about the high transit fees going through the Panama Canal, which that too has a climate cause, because the freshwater lakes that provide the water for the canal to actually operate are low because of drought. That's climate-induced drought. And so less ships can go through the canal, which means transit rates are much higher. Trump's friends in the shipping industry and corporations and business, they don't like that. They've complained to him about it. There's also, too, it's easy to pin this upon the Chinese, because there is a Chinese presence all throughout Latin America. But that Chinese presence in Latin America is there because the American presence has been so disastrous and ruinous for Central and South American countries that the American presence has been entirely extractive and exploitive, as opposed to providing anything to those nations. And now the Chinese are showing up, not just in Latin America, but also in Africa, throughout the Middle East, and providing better options, better alternative for those countries. And I don't, maybe the Chinese are going to be just as extractive and exploitive as the Americans in the West have been for these decades, but that's not proven yet. And these countries can, in the Americas, in the Middle East, right, in Africa, can point to the last 7 or 8 decades of ruinous and treacherous and destructive Western monetary, financial, and economic policies. The order that we set up, right? We created the World Bank, we created the IMF. People go back, read about Bretton Woods in 1944, which establishes the monetary and economic order of the world post World War II, right? All those things, people are saying, no thanks, we don't want this anymore. We're gonna see what the Chinese have to offer. So again, American policies being the cause of America's own decline. So I mean, you heard this in Trump's address in his inauguration. We gave it to Panama. We didn't give it to China. We're taking back the Panama Canal. Certainly, you can make the arguments of national security. That's obvious. But the point being is that Trump envisions the American empire differently than Joe Biden or Barack Obama or Bill Clinton or George W. Bush did. And I think this is coming from Trump's own life, his own experience. He's already been, he's been a mogul. He's been an emperor, if you will, a real estate emperor, right? And his view of how it worked, of what works best, of what needs to be done, I think informs why he is willing to change things, why he's willing to, say, walk away from Europe. If you're a real estate emperor, you have to shift with the market, right? There will be times where, yes, you want to purchase stuff inner city. And then there's, the market's going to change and people won't want to live or work in inner city. And you have to shift. And now you have to build stuff in the suburbs, right? I mean, just, even just on a more micro level, you see this all the time with home construction, right? People have living rooms and dining rooms and the kitchen has a door separating it. And then now, no, everyone wants open floor plans now, right? Yes. So it's dynamic. And I think that's how Trump views the American empire, as something that should be dynamic, that should shift. And so I think it's important to note as well that the Trump administration going forward does not see Europe as fitting into that dynamic. And certainly the Trump vision it prioritizes China to a degree, the Middle East, one in the relationship with Israel, but also too because Iran is that great white whale for so many. But then Latin America, Central and South America. played an enormous part of Trump's speech, his statements, and the appointment of Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. If you think of Rubio, you're not going to think about China. You're not going to think about Europe. You're not even really thinking about Israel or Palestine. You're going to think about Central and South America. That has been Rubio's focus. That's where his passion is. That's where he claims his roots from, even though his family didn't come from Cuba under Castro, but from Batista. They fled from the American-backed dictator, actually, right? But so anyway, you have this focus by Donald Trump that is still imperial. He's still the emperor, but his view of the empire differs, and he wants to change it to better achieve his own interests, but also, too, I think what he really does believe as the interest of the United States. So the things about Greenland and Panama should be taken seriously. Now, are we going to, is the 82nd Airborne going to parachute into Greenland anytime soon? I don't think so. Same with the Panama Canal. I don't think so. Could regime change happen in the Panama Canal? Absolutely. Absolutely. Could we muscle and try and force Denmark into some type of joint partnership in Greenland? I think that's what they're going to look to do. Mexico is the real big issue. Mexico, of course, the immigration issue, their desire to deport everybody. I guess what they're going to do is we've got 11 million undocumented people in this country to FEMA. I think that the plan is to give all of us legal people big butterfly nets, and we're going to run around and capture all the undocumented people. It's absurd, right? But the thing that's serious and what's really concerning to the Mexicans is this designation of the cartels in Mexico, the drug cartels, as foreign terrorist groups. And you have to remember that Michael Waltz, who is Trump's national security advisor, he sponsored a bill last year in Congress to authorize the use of military force by the United States in Mexico. Oh, wow. And so this is very, very serious in the sense that I know these people think, well, we'll just send advisors down there. We'll send down their special forces, the Green Berets, and they're already down there doing that. I have a friend of mine who was down there with a SEAL team doing that years ago. They've been doing that for a long time. Well, we'll do more of it then. Okay, well, then we're going to have to do some drone strikes, right? And what's that going to accomplish? It just builds and builds. And next thing you know, we're going to have the 10th Mountain Division in the Sierra Madres. And how anyone think that's going to go well, right? So the issue with Mexico is very serious and very dangerous. And the idea that there is popular support for carrying out strikes against the cartels in a manner reminiscent of what Tom Clancy would write about, in his novels. And unfortunately, many in Washington, D.C., that's where their strategic and military knowledge comes from reading things like Tom Clancy. This idea that the United States could enter into a war in Mexico is not so far-fetched. Is it probable? No, it's not probable, but is it possible? Yes, and that is really dangerous. So again, that's why I encourage people to go and watch Donald Trump's inauguration address, because it was very serious and he lays these things out. And he is a very transactional president. Let's look at his role as in real estate. And so he knows he has to make good on his promises. He knows he needs to give to those who have given to him. And so certainly you saw, I think especially the most dramatic and ridiculous aspect of this was in his inauguration address, where Trump announces that we're going to go to Mars. And you can see in the background, Elon Musk flips out. He gets so excited because his company SpaceX will make billions upon billions, right? So, but you see that Trump is going to do that. He's going to give back to those who give to him, as well as, but at the same time too, he views things as dynamic as needing to shift or change. And so maybe in like what happened in Afghanistan when he comes into office in 2017, goes along with Madison McMaster, authorizes a massive escalation of the war in Afghanistan, drops more bombs in 2 years than Obama did in 8 years in Afghanistan, if I recall that correctly. Then when it's not working, he shifts and he negotiates with the Taliban. So is that something maybe we could hope for? The other thing, and I'll leave it on this, is that you see in Trump a desire to make deals, a desire to negotiate, a desire for diplomacy, essentially. America's diplomatic service is, at best, you can accuse them of malpractice, but it's been gutted, it's been hollowed out. There's been no desire for diplomacy in the U.S. in decades. Trump is going to run into that opposition. All of his people who he's put in power don't believe in diplomacy. They don't believe in negotiating or talking. The imperial mindset, of course, is we don't negotiate, we don't talk, we are the empire. And so any threat to us, we use force against. They believe in force and violence, not negotiations, not talking, not diplomacy. Will Trump run into that? And the last thing I'll leave it with this is that there is speculation out there that Trump wants a grand bargain in the Middle East, that he wants to continue on with his Abraham Accords from the first term and get this grand bargain that brings about greater Middle East for several reasons. But one of them that can't be ignored is his desire to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And I think, will that ego of his desire to have a Nobel Peace Prize, because Obama had one, or whatever his mania about it is, will that push a lot of American policy with regards to the Middle East, or even to, say, Ukraine and Russia gets a Nobel Peace Prize for ending the Ukraine war, that type of thing? Those are the types of things that we can scoff at, but those types of things really have effects in terms of policymaking. The character of the people, right? Their individual decision-making oftentimes has that effect on policy.
Yeah. Matthew, thank you. One last question.
Sure.
What do you think about the relationship between Musk and Trump? I know I've heard you say that they may be on a collision course, because at some stage, if there's sanctions applied on China and tariffs, is going to hurt Elon Musk. But also, I think there's another collision course, because Musk maybe has even a bigger ego than Trump and is even wealthier than Trump, so has more resources. But Trump, for all his faults, is his own man. He doesn't allow anyone to dominate him. So from a personality point of view as well, I see at some stage they might be at loggerhead.
I think so. I think there's like, you already saw this kind of collision between Vivek Ramaswamy and Musk and Trump, where Ramaswamy, who was supposed to be the co-chair of the Department of Governmental Efficiency, this organization that Elon Musk is setting up to slash government spending. Vivek Ramaswamy, who was one of the Republican presidential candidates in this last election, he's out. He said some things on Twitter, but also too, I think there were internal behind the doors things where these guys were colliding. And now, of course, he's going to run for governor of Ohio and everything, but everything you read says no, that's occurring, but he's out because of other reasons, because of this clash. And so, just as you said, this idea that just take China, Trump's threatening of tariffs, his hostility, doesn't do well for Musk's business. And so much of Musk's business, so much of his fortune is tied up in China. I mean, he's got SpaceX, he's got Twitter X, but so much is tied up in China as well, with his electric vehicle production as well as other pursuits. And so, at some point, do these things collide where their interests are not the same? Donald's interest really is imperial. He really is the emperor. And there are personal, but also too institutional things that will motivate him because of that. Elon Musk's interests are his company, his corporation, his shareholders, and himself, his wealth. Elon Musk's most important thing, I would venture to say, is to maintain his status as the world's wealthiest man until the day he dies. Right? That's probably his paramount concern. And so you're going to have a conflict at some point where they collide. And so, we'll see. Right now, they act as the best of friends, and gifts are given, such as we're going to Mars. But we will see if that when and if that conflict arises. But I would bet, like in a year or two or so, that friendship is gone and they've parted ways.
Matthew, I think because Trump can't run for another term after this, I think Elon Musk in his mind sees himself as the next president.
He might. He certainly Does he want that though, or does he just want to be the kingmaker that he is? You know,
True.
something really important happened in American politics back in December. So every year, the American Congress fails to pass budgets for the 12 or 13 different budget lines is supposed to pass budgets for. So we're all the different departments of the government, right? They usually get the defense budget through, and they get the veterans budget through, and one or two others. And the rest, they all jam together into what's called an omnibus spending bill. And this always happens at the end of December as the Congress is ending. They've got to get this done in the last few days. And part of this spending bill, and of course, they throw members of Congress throw everything into that, right? As you'd expect, right? This thing's got to get passed. And so we're going to throw everything into it that we want. One of the things that got put in there was a bill that would severely have limited American technological transfers to China. This really would have hurt Musk's business in China. And when Musk found out it was in there, he tweeted out, anyone who goes along with this spending bill, I am going to personally ensure they don't win re-election. This is a guy who's worth $400 billion. He can get that done. And within a half a day, Republicans had deserted this bill. This was widely seen as a Trump-approved bill. It was Speaker Johnson's bill. This was something that Musk stepped in and ruined for them.
Wow.
And he had that power to do that just by tweeting, just by posting on X. He got Republicans to shift. So it showed the power of the wealth that he has, his influence, both with information, right? You know, able to speak to people and get people to do what he says, right? Call your member of Congress and tell them not to vote for this. And if any of them do, I'm going to make sure they're out next term, right? So, yeah, as well as the wealth that he has, the power to actually get things done. So does Musk want to then be the person who's actually being voted upon, where people don't like this guy, he's weird, he acts funny, you know, I mean, he's pretentious, he's entitled, or does he want to be the kingmaker that he is and the world's wealthiest man with his mass base of loyal followers who may not transit? I mean, just because he's wealthy doesn't mean he's going to win the election. Michael Bloomberg, best example of that, the former mayor of New York City, Bloomberg Corporation, his namesake, right? He spent $1 billion trying to become the Democratic presidential nominee, and he got nowhere. You know, I forget what the numbers came out to, how much he spent per vote, and it was, you know, so yeah, I mean, it's a good question about what Musk expects to do, but I think he wants to maintain his role as world's wealthiest person and then become you know, he's got this position as kingmaker essentially and maintaining that. But also too, if Trump is serious about only serving one term, it'll be interesting to see what he carries out and how he does it. They still certainly are, the White House certainly still is, needs to respond to the realities of American politics. They don't have a very large majority in the House of Representatives. And certainly they don't have a supermajority as they need in the U.S. Senate to get past what we call a filibuster here, where in the U.S. Senate, you need 60 votes to advance a bill, essentially, not 50, 100 people in the Senate. So you need a supermajority, not a simple majority. They don't have that. And in the House, where you do need simple majorities to pass things, they have a very small very small majority. I think it's only 3 or 4. So the 2026 elections, if they lose the House, there goes the ability of Trump to get things done legislatively in the second half of his term. So the Trump administration will have to be responsive to domestic political realities, including the demands of someone like Elon Musk. And that may further then put them on a road on a road to conflict and confrontation with Musk.
Very interesting. Thank you so much, Matthew. I really enjoyed speaking with you today. We touched upon a number of issues that are really interesting. I'd love to have you back to kind of dig into them further, from Afghanistan to West Bank, Mexico, Greenland, but also just Trump's presidency. So I hope you'll be back soon.
Absolutely. I appreciate it. And yeah, thank you for having me. I enjoyed it. And yeah, happy to come back and talk with you anytime.
Thank you so much, Matthew.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.